The other snipers laughed when they first saw it. Some wondered if he'd built it himself in a some way behind the lines. Others thought maybe he'd salvaged it from a scrapyard, cobbled together from pieces that didn't quite belong to one another. The stock looked uneven, almost crude. The modifications were visible even from a distance, asymmetrical, and improvised in a way that suggested desperation rather than precision. One Austrian soldier, a man who prided himself on his marksmanship and his finely tuned Mauser, actually walked over to get a closer look. Convinced that what he was seeing couldn't possibly be real, he turned to his companions with a smirk that needed no translation. This man, this newcomer with his strange rifle and his quiet demeanor, couldn't possibly be serious. He couldn't possibly expect to compete with men who'd been trained by the best instructors the German military had to offer, men who'd spent months perfecting their craft in the mountains and valleys of occupied Europe. And yet, within 3 weeks, 15 enemy snipers would be dead because of that strange weapon, and the man holding it would become something the Allies had learned to fear in the frozen landscapes of the Eastern Front. His name was Matthias Hetzenauer, and nobody remembers laughing at him after the first week. But before we understand what made his weapon so effective, before we grasp why a rifle that looked like it belonged in a museum base became one of the deadliest in the German side of World War II, we need to understand what was happening in those mountains. In those endless white expanses where men died without sound, and where a single mistake could mean the difference between returning to your trench or being carried back in pieces. This is a story about adaptation, about what happens when doctrine meets desperation, and about how sometimes the tools that win wars aren't the ones that look impressive in parades or photographs. Sometimes they're the ones that simply refuse to fail when everything else already has. The year was 1943, and the Eastern Front had become a kind of frozen hell that defied the strategic assumptions of every German officer who'd planned the invasion of the Soviet Union. The confident predictions of a swift victory, the calculations that assumed Russian resistance would collapse under the weight of German firepower and tactical superiority had all dissolved into something far more complex and far more brutal. The war had become attritional, grinding, a contest not of brilliant maneuvers but of endurance and resources. And in that environment, in the mountain passes and forest lines where conventional infantry tactics often proved suicidal, the sniper had evolved from a specialist role into something approaching a strategic asset. A single skilled marksman could halt an entire platoon's advance, could create psychological pressure that rippled through enemy ranks, could force opponents to move differently, think differently, calculate every exposure with the knowledge that somewhere in the distance, invisible and patient, someone was waiting for exactly that moment of carelessness. Hetzenauer had arrived at the front with the standard-issue Karabiner 98s that every German infantryman knew intimately. It was a good rifle, reliable and accurate within its design parameters. But Hetzenauer wasn't interested in designed parameters. He was interested in something else entirely, something that had to do with the specific conditions of mountain warfare and the particular demands of engaging targets at extreme distances in weather that could shift from clear to blinding snow in minutes. He'd grown up in the Tyrolean Alps, in terrain that most soldiers found alien and hostile, but that felt to him like an extension of his own body. He understood cold in a way that training manuals couldn't teach. He understood wind, understood how it moved differently at altitude, how it could betray even the most careful calculation. And he understood, perhaps more importantly, that the standard equipment he'd been given wasn't optimized for the kind of work he intended to do. The modifications began almost immediately, and they were the kind of changes that made armory officers nervous. Hetzenauer started with the stock, reshaping it in ways that made the rifle easier to hold in the prone position for extended periods, adjusting the cheek weld so that his eye alignment with the scope remained consistent even when his muscles were screaming from hours of motionless observation. He altered the trigger pull, lightening it to a point that would have made most instructors uncomfortable, but that gave him the kind of instantaneous response when a target appeared for only seconds. He modified the barrel, shortening it slightly in a way that reduced the weapon's effective range on paper, but improved its handling characteristics in confined spaces and reduced the visible signature of muzzle flash in low-light conditions. Each change was deliberate, based not on theory but on the accumulated experience of someone who'd spent his entire life in exactly the kind of environment where he now found himself fighting. But the most significant modification, the one that would later define his effectiveness and become almost legendary among those who knew the details, involved the scope itself and how it was mounted. Hetzenauer had noticed something that other snipers either hadn't observed or hadn't considered worth addressing. The standard scope mounts created a specific parallax error at certain distances, a slight misalignment between the scope's reticle and the actual point of impact that became more pronounced beyond 600 meters. For most shooters, this wasn't a serious problem, because most engagements happened well within that range. But Hetzenauer wasn't planning to engage at most ranges. He was planning to engage at distances where enemy soldiers felt safe, where they moved without the constant hypervigilance that defined life in the forward trenches, where they made mistakes because they believed themselves beyond the reach of effective fire. And at those distances, the parallax error became something that could turn a perfect shot into a clean miss. So he improvised, using materials he scavenged and techniques he'd learned from gunsmiths in his village, techniques that had nothing to do with military standardization and everything to do with the practical needs of hunters who couldn't afford to miss. He created a mounting system that looked crude but performed with a precision that factory standard equipment couldn't match. The scope sat slightly off-center, canted in a way that appeared wrong until you understood the geometry of what he was trying to achieve. The adjustments were made with shims cut from shell casings and secured with wire that looked like it might come loose at any moment but never did. To anyone who didn't understand the underlying physics, it looked like amateur hour. To anyone who did understand, it looked like genius wearing the disguise of desperation. And then he took it to the mountains, and the killing began. The first target was a Soviet officer who thought he was safe because he was more than 800 meters from the German lines, standing outside a command post in what he assumed was a position of complete security. Hetzenauer had been watching him for 2 days, studying his patterns, noting the times when he emerged from the dugout, mapping the routes he took, the places he paused, the moments of vulnerability that repeated themselves with the regularity of routine. They were the kind of enemy that you respected even as you planned their deaths. Professionals executing their mission with competence that would have been admirable in any other context. German command tasked Hetzenauer with neutralizing them, a mission that was easier to assign than to accomplish. He approached the problem the way a hunter approaches dangerous game, with respect for the quarry and an understanding that one mistake would likely be fatal. He studied the pattern of casualties, mapped the angles of incoming fire, calculated the likely positions based on terrain features and sightline. Then he moved into the area not as a sniper, but as bait, deliberately exposing himself in ways calculated to draw fire while remaining prepared to move the instant he heard the shot. It was phenomenally dangerous, the kind of tactic that command would have forbidden if they'd known about it, but it worked. On the second day, the Soviet sniper took the shot, aiming for what appeared to be a careless German soldier pausing to adjust his equipment in a position that offered a clean firing lane. But Hetzenauer had already identified the microsecond of muzzle flash, already marked the location with the kind of precision that only comes from absolute focus. He relocated immediately, circled to a position that gave him the correct angle, and waited. The Soviet sniper, having successfully engaged what he thought was a legitimate target, would need to relocate according to his training. But there would be a window, a brief period where he and his spotter would need to move, where they would necessarily expose themselves to observation from someone who knew exactly where to look. Hetzenauer waited through that window, his modified rifle steady against his shoulder, his breathing controlled, his mind clear of everything except the shot he was about to take. When the Soviet spotter emerged from concealment, moving with the careful speed of someone who understood their danger but believed they were executing their withdrawal quickly enough to remain safe, Hetzenauer fired. The range was over 900 meters, through air that was moving unpredictably, with a target that was in motion. The shot should have been nearly impossible. The spotter fell, and before the Soviet sniper could process what had happened, before he could react or retreat or return fire, Hetzenauer had cycled his bolt and fired again. Both men died within seconds of each other, eliminated by a weapon that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts, but performed with a consistency that military-grade equipment often couldn't match. That kill, more than any other, established Hetzenauer's reputation not just as an effective sniper, but as something approaching a phenomenon, the distances involved, the conditions, the quality of his targets, all combined to create a narrative that spread through both German and Soviet lines. On the German side, he became a symbol of what individual skill could accomplish even as the broader strategic situation deteriorated. On the Soviet side, he became a named threat, someone whose presence in a sector changed how operations were planned and executed. Soviet snipers began actively hunting for him, dedicating resources to his elimination that might otherwise have been deployed elsewhere. In the strange mathematics of war, this was actually a strategic victory even beyond his direct tactical impact. By forcing the enemy to divert effort toward countering a single individual, he was creating advantages for German forces across his entire operational area. But there was a cost to this effectiveness that's easy to overlook when focusing on numbers and tactical outcomes. Hetzenauer was operating in a mode that few soldiers could sustain indefinitely, pushing himself to physical and psychological limits that would eventually extract their price. The isolation inherent in sniper operations, the need to remain separate from regular infantry units created a psychological distance that was difficult to bridge. He spent days alone in positions where the closest human contact was the enemy he was hunting, where the only voices he heard were either his own thoughts or the distant sounds of combat. The act of killing at distance, of watching men die through a magnified scope, created a specific kind of psychological burden that was different from the experience of close combat. In close combat, survival instinct and immediate danger provided a kind of psychological buffer, a framework that helped soldiers process what they were doing. At distance, through a scope with time to observe and think and recognize the humanity of the target before pulling the trigger, the psychological impact accumulated differently. The winter of 1943 into 1944 was particularly brutal, even by Eastern Front standards. Temperatures dropped to levels that made metal brittle and oil congeal, that turned exposed skin black with frostbite within minutes. Supply lines struggled to maintain flow, meaning that soldiers often went without adequate food or heating fuel. In that environment, Hetzenauer continued operating with a consistency that seemed almost inhuman. His modified rifle, unlike many standard-issue weapons, continued functioning reliably even in temperatures that caused other firearms to malfunction. The modifications he'd made, born from his understanding of cold weather conditions, meant that his weapon didn't suffer from the same problems that plagued other snipers. While others struggled with frozen actions or condensation-related reliability issues, his rifle simply worked, shot after shot, kill after kill. By early spring, his confirmed kill count had reached 345, a number that placed him among the most effective snipers of the entire war on any side. But the nature of those kills, the circumstances and distances and difficulty, made the raw number almost misleading. Many snipers accumulated high counts through opportunities that presented themselves regularly in static warfare, through defensive positions where targets were plentiful and conditions were relatively controlled. Hetzenauer's kills were different. They were the product of active hunting in terrain that provided minimal margin for error, against opponents who were themselves skilled and cautious, at ranges that pushed the absolute limits of what his equipment could accomplish. Each kill represented not just accuracy but planning, patience, and an understanding of ballistics that went far beyond standard training. And yet, for all his effectiveness, Hetzenauer remained strangely modest about his accomplishment, at least by the standards of propaganda that increasingly dominated German military culture in the latter war years. He didn't seek publicity, didn't cooperate enthusiastically with efforts to turn him into a propaganda figure. When interviewed, he spoke about his work in technical terms, describing shots and conditions and decisions without the kind of dramatic embellishment that would have made for better propaganda copy. He seemed to view his role as a job that needed doing, rather than as an opportunity for glory, a perspective that was increasingly rare as the war ground on and the need for morale boosting narratives became more desperate. In a military culture that increasingly celebrated heroism as performance, he remained focused on effectiveness as craft. The spring of 1944 brought new complexities to the Eastern Front as Soviet forces launched major offensives designed to capitalize on their growing material advantages. The strategic situation for German forces deteriorated steadily. Even effective tactical performance couldn't compensate for the fundamental imbalances in resources and manpower. His ammunition ran low, then ran out completely, and he withdrew only when there was literally nothing more he could do. The column made it through. The cost in Soviet casualties wasn't particularly high in absolute terms, perhaps a dozen men killed, and twice that number wounded, but the delay imposed had achieved its objective. And Hetzenauer, descending from his position with a rifle, that by this point looked even more battered and improvised than when he'd started, rejoined his unit with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd done his job under impossible conditions and succeeded because of preparation and skill. And a weapon that had never failed him when it mattered most. The end came not in combat, but through capture. As German forces collapsed in the final weeks of the war, Sachudi was overrun by Soviet troops who by this point had learned to identify high-value prisoners. His modified rifle, the weapon that had killed hundreds of Soviet soldiers, was confiscated immediately. Later accounts suggest it was examined by Soviet military technicians who wanted to understand what made it so effective, though the specific fate of the weapon itself remains unclear in historical records. Hetzenauer spent years in Soviet captivity, surviving conditions that killed many prisoners, eventually returning to Austria in 1950, after the kind of ordeal that left permanent marks on everyone who endured it. He lived quietly after the war, rarely speaking about his experiences, avoiding the kind of publicity that some veterans sought or accepted. The modified rifle that had made him one of the most effective snipers of the entire war existed now only in photographs and descriptions, in the memories of men who'd seen it in action, in the official records that documented its results without fully explaining its design. Various military historians and firearms experts attempted to recreate his modifications based on those descriptions, trying to understand exactly what he'd done. Most concluded that while the technical modifications were significant, they were only part of the explanation. The weapon's effectiveness had depended ultimately on the man holding it, on his understanding of terrain and weather and ballistics, on his patience and discipline, and willingness to exist in conditions that would have destroyed most soldiers' effectiveness. And that's perhaps the real lesson buried in this story, the part that goes beyond the tactical details and technical specifications. Hetzenauer succeeded not because he had access to superior technology, but because he understood how to adapt available technology to his specific needs, how to modify and improve, based on empirical testing rather than assumption. The rifle that other snipers mocked looked crude because it prioritized function over form, performance over appearance. Every modification served a specific purpose based on the actual conditions of mountain warfare in extreme weather, and the cumulative effect of those modifications was a weapon system that outperformed factory-standard equipment in the context where it was deployed. The broader military lessons are obvious in retrospect but were less clear at the time. Standardization has enormous advantages in terms of logistics and training and maintenance, but it also creates conformity that can become a disadvantage when conditions deviate significantly from whatever assumptions informed the standardization. The soldiers who succeed in those non-standard conditions are often the ones willing to depart from doctrine, to trust their own experience and judgment over institutional wisdom, to accept being mocked for using equipment that looks wrong if that equipment performs right when it mattered. Hetzenauer was mocked until he wasn't, until the results spoke loudly enough that the laughter stopped and the questions began. There's something profoundly human in that progression, something that extends beyond military history into broader questions about innovation and adaptation. The willingness to look foolish, to use tools that don't fit conventional expectations, to persist through skepticism based on confidence in your own understanding rather than on external validation. These are characteristics that define effective adaptation in any context. Hetzenauer happened to apply them in warfare, but the underlying principle translates across domains. Sometimes the tool that looks like junk performs like lightning, because someone understood what actually mattered and had the skill and courage to build accordingly. Looking back across the decades that separate us from those frozen mountains, from those desperate battles and impossible shots, it's tempting to focus on the numbers, on the confirmed kills, and the tactical victories and the strategic impact. But the numbers, while impressive, aren't really the point. The point is that in a conflict that killed millions through industrial-scale violence, in a war defined by massive artillery barrages and tank formations and aerial bombardment, there remains space for individual skill and innovation to matter. One man with a modified rifle and an intimate understanding of his environment could still create effects that rippled through battles and influenced outcomes. That reality, both inspiring and terrible, captures something essential about warfare that survives all technological advancement. Hetzenauer's story doesn't offer simple moral lessons or comfortable conclusions. He was fighting for a cause that history has judged harshly, serving a regime whose crimes are well documented. His individual effectiveness as a soldier doesn't change or excuse those larger truths. But within the specific context of military history and the evolution of sniper warfare, his adaptation and success represent a case study worth understanding. The weapon that looked like junk shot like lightning, because someone made it do so, because technical knowledge combined with practical experience in the hands of someone willing to trust his own judgment over institutional convention. That's a story that transcends any single conflict, any particular historical moment, even as it remains forever rooted in the specific circumstances of mountain warfare on the Eastern Front during the final years of the Second World War. And perhaps that's the image worth holding onto from this entire narrative. Not the kill count or the tactical victories, or even the modified rifle itself, but rather the moment when the laughter stopped and the questions began. When what had looked ridiculous suddenly looked brilliant because the results could no longer be denied. That moment of recognition, when performance forces reappraisal of assumption, when effectiveness demands respect regardless of appearance, that's the moment when adaptation proves its worth. Hetzenauer created that moment through skill and persistence, and a weapon that everyone thought was a joke until it killed.